Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Lucky 13 in our series. My name is Jessica Blumenthal, and I'm a director in the Banking and Finance Department at ENS Africa. Today's webinar forms part of a CPD series presented by the department to assist regulated persons in the financial services sector to obtain the CPD hours or the continuous professional development hours that they need before the end of the cycle. And just a reminder, the CPD cycle is ending at the end of this month, May. This year, we are presenting 16 hours of CPD accredited masterclasses, and we've used this opportunity to spotlight topics under the ESG banner, which we think are of importance to the industry. Throughout this series, you will have met some of our experts from different departments and offices in our firm, all of them specialists in their own fields, but also working collaboratively as part of our ESG practice group, to ensure that we explore the implications of developments in this field across all our disciplines, sectors, and throughout Africa. So before I introduce our panel, just a few housekeeping points. For those of you who are joining us for certificates, please just remember that we need to be able to verify that you've been in attendance for the duration of this webinar. So please do stay online and on board. Our team get the verification stats immediately after the webinar, and you should receive your certificate about 2 or 3 days after today. Then we do still have some webinars coming up next week being the final week of the series. So if you are interested, or if you need 3 more hours of CPD accredited time, then please do register and join us for those webinars. I will talk a bit more about that at the end of this session, just to give you a taste of what's upcoming. Then we are taking Q&A. So there is a Q&A block at the bottom of the screen. If you'd like to share your questions with us, you can do so in that block. You can, of course, also email either Colin or Mansour, our 2 panelists today, directly if you'd like to ask them a question, and they'll be happy to engage further with you. And another option, if you'd like to speak to them in person or to meet them, is you can join us at one of our cocktail events, which we'll be hosting to round up this series at the end of the month. There's one in both Cape Town and in Johannesburg. So please do register and come and meet us at those events. It'll be great to see you after we've been together, at least across the screen, for so many of these sessions now. So then to turn to the order of today. So I have my 2 colleagues with me, Mansour Parker from our tax department and Colin Fratelli Davies from our natural resources and environment department. And as I said, both of them form part of the ESG practice group, and they have been looking at all sorts of things under this banner. But today they'll be talking about the effect of European regulatory developments and what that could mean for businesses operating on the continent. And essentially, we'll be just kicking off and starting that conversation today. And it will probably need a lot more thinking and a lot more work. But both Mansour and Colin have done a lot of work in this space, and they'll be sharing with you their insights and their thoughts, really to sensitize South African businesses and those active in South Africa, but who have trading partners in Europe, as to what these developments could mean for them. So I'm going to hand over now to Colin, who will take you through the first part of the presentation, and who will then hand over to Mansour, and Mansour will then finish up for us. Thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you, Jess. I agree that I think we could have an entire series dedicated to the EU Green Deal. It's quite vast, so I am going to try my best just to highlight a few items and what it deals with, some risks and opportunities, and obviously focusing on the supply chain and African exports to the EU. Okay. I'm going to share my presentation. Great. Okay, so as I said, I'm going to go through a few items, and just as an introduction.
Sorry, Colin. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you. You might just want to switch you showing it not in presenter mode. So perhaps just switch it.
I was wondering.
Otherwise, it's so small that us with old eyes will struggle to see it.
No, thank you. Okay, this one. Okay, that one should be the right one. Is that the right one?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so going back to the EGD, as it's referred to, was established on the 14th of July in 2021, and it is it's vast in all of the different strategies and plans that it covers. And the ultimate goal is to lower emissions by 55% by 2030. And the EU wants to basically become the first climate neutral region in the world by 2050. So this is a very ambitious target, and it links to quite a few aspects, notably no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, economic growth decoupled from resource use, and a focus point as well is no person and no place left behind, which I believe is very important for Africa. And obviously we have existing economic issues, and hopefully the EGD will not impact in a negative way and leave Africa behind. And another important aspect of the EGD is lots of funding, around 1 trillion euros, and that also includes the just transition mechanism, and that speaks specifically to the no person, no place left behind. So funds have been set aside to assist third world countries or countries who are maybe not as advanced in various aspects as Europe is. And so it generally just deals with the shift of moving to a low carbon economy and to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. When looking at the content, as I said, it's vast, so it covers quite a lot. I'm just going to run through the majority of the items that it covers, and then I'm going to focus on a few after that. And so obviously the focus stemming from the Paris Agreement is climate action, and the European climate law has been enacted, and that is binding on all EU member states. It's referred to as a shortened version as Fit for 55 package, and it covers various regulations, directives, and other items that are set to regulate the EU member states. Then moving to clean energy policy, so that focuses on the decarbonization of the EU energy system. So moving to renewable energy sources, particularly offshore power, and also clean hydrogen, which I see hydrogen is also one of the series, part of the series. So I think watch that if you want more detail, because I just don't have time to go into that. And then another aspect is sustainable industry. So that's referred to as the Circular Economy Action Plan. That one in particular, I'm going to focus on a little bit later. And then another aspect, construction is very energy intensive. For Europe, they have determined that it's about 40% of their energy consumption. So there is a focus there to clean up essentially the building and construction industry and use things like renovations. The renovation wave is a policy which seeks to renovate buildings and employ energy, renewable energy or less intensive energy to heat buildings and that type of thing. There's also the EU emission trading system, so linked to green buildings or buildings that use less carbon. They can be linked to trading systems for credits. And then there's also the construction products regulation, and that then goes into using alternative products that are obviously less energy intensive. And then there's also sustainable mobility that focuses more on on consumers or the population. I think they'll see an impact there the most. And transport, as I'm sure everyone's well aware, that's also very energy intensive. Again, 25% determined for the EU specifically. And so there are a few strategies, one for sustainable and smart mobility. And the aim is to cut 90% of the existing energy consumption by 2050, which is quite a high target. And they'll do this through things like emission standards. So that's obviously for your cars and public transport, using battery supply, so lithium-ion batteries, a focus on that, and trans-European transport, I think trying to cut down on that and just use transport that isn't as energy intensive. And then the aviation sector, of course, is also included just due to the high impact. Then further, there's also eliminating pollution. So there's a zero pollution action plan, which focuses on water, air, and soil, and how industry will have to work together to prevent unnecessary pollution. And there's also a chemical strategy for sustainability. And importantly, there's also a revision of existing laws. So the EU Commission will go through existing laws in the EU, and obviously then the member states will also do the same exercise just to see that their regulations and their laws are tight enough to prevent pollution and make amendments where they need to. Then, oh, sorry, too soon. Farm to fork. This is referred to as the heart of the EGD, and it relates to the agricultural sector, right from obviously growing of crops all the way through to waste, food waste. And it's also a very heavy energy intensive industry. 21 to 37% of emissions in the EU stem from agriculture and the food sector. I'm also going to deal with that a little bit later in more detail. Then there's also preserving biodiversity. Again, this is going to be another webinar, which you can watch later on this week. And so preserving biodiversity is also a focus point. And here there is a specific reference to Africa as well. I think they pronounce it Nature Africa, using ties with Africa to have carbon credit projects and the like. And there are just a few concerns there, obviously, with conservation. Often people are displaced. So I think there's just some important work to be done there. And it also just deals with, again, biodiversity and the industries that impact on biodiversity the most: construction, agriculture, food and drink. There's also some focus to restore forests and soils and wetlands. Then underpinning all of these items and all of the elements is research and development. So there's massive emphasis on that, on technology, new technologies, transformation of financial models, and also supply chains. And then, as I mentioned, then the last point, which Mansour will be going into more detail on, is preventing unfair advantage from carbon leakage. And that's through the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which Mansour will deal with. And then here on the screen, I just have a brief sort of infographic on trade between Africa and Europe. So it is one of our large trading partners. And so that's why this type of deal is really important, to focus on what risks there are, what opportunities there are, to get ahead of it, to get on top of it, so that we aren't left behind, as they've already focused on. South Africa, you can see there, 50.4% of coal, ferrochromium, and vehicles are sent via sea. This also just goes into detail on the different forms of transport to the EU. And this specifically deals with SADC. So there is still obviously the rest of Africa that also trades with the EU. Then some key concepts just that I'd like to focus on. One aspect which I already mentioned was the circular economy and action plan. And circularity has been around for quite a while, so it's nothing new. And there are also existing policies in Africa. So this just focuses on making sure that it's implemented and put into law where necessary. And ultimately, circularity and the circular economy deals with reducing pressure on natural resources by transforming the design, production, and consumption of products so that there is no waste. So essentially just to keep it, as it says, in a circular system. And then this focuses on the textile, construction, and electronics, as well as plastics industry. In particular, I think those industries, there really is room for developing circularity and to avoid wastes and use waste that does come into, that is generated. And as I mentioned, it does, again here, we look at not leaving any countries behind. And an interesting point is that Africa in a lot of the documents is specifically mentioned in the EGD. No other regions are mentioned. So I think there is some focus and definite opportunities for Africa. And part of the circularity is to try and strengthen partnerships with Africa and ensure free trade agreements that they reflect the objectives of circularity, and then to also have outreach activities. Then next, the heart of the EGD as I mentioned, which relates to agriculture, fisheries, and the food system. This again is very detailed and it goes into various aspects. There are 27 actions, and these actions link from production, processing, retailing, and food waste. And it's to ensure that the food system is fair, healthy, and environmentally friendly. What's interesting is that South Africa exports quite a lot of organic fruits and vegetables. And apparently in Europe, they only internally they supply about 10%, which is quite low. And part of this aim is to push that number up to 25%. So, but luckily, I think they're a bit behind Africa in that respect. So that's good news for Africa and South Africa in particular. Then further, there are 9 objectives, and then there are also pillars. So the pillars focus on consumer demand. So I think that again is shifting things like using or focusing on organic vegetables and fruit. Then the food production itself, supply chain, how the food is produced all the way through to waste. And then also industry behavior and trade policy. So trade policy, again, is a focus point for Africa. And then, as I mentioned, it's interesting that the farm to fork essentially is taking a niche area, namely organic, and they're trying to make it mainstream. So it will be really interesting to see how that develops. Right, then also traceability. So traceability links to obviously how something is produced, where it's produced, who produces it. And it's going to be very important in tracing things like your carbon emissions, and also just linked to, and that's why I've put it on the same slide, linked to your supply chain due diligence. So the two go hand in hand. And that's where the focus is, just to ensure that from employees to the environment, that the impacts are traced and checked. And the important shift here will be labels and supply chain management. I think with the development of technology and things like blockchain, I think there's a lot of room for new technologies and growth in this area. And so it's something that Africa must stay on top of, and hopefully we can even develop some of these new technologies and supply chain management schemes to ensure that traceability is ensured. And then, as I said, the supply chain due diligence is also very closely linked to that. And so with the trade partners for Europe, it links to scope 1 through to scope 3 carbon emissions. And so that's where the tracing of a supply chain is quite fast, and often where the products are manufactured or where minerals are extracted in Africa, those will link more to your scope 3 carbon emissions for existing companies in the EU. So essentially, this just links to ESG and how the employees' well-being and the transparency and governance is dealt with by suppliers for those companies in Europe. And so one aspect for Africa, which is quite important, is certifications. So at the moment, I think it's an area that needs to be developed further, and having things like certifications and other management companies who can take the load off of smaller companies, that will really assist and ensure legitimacy of the supply chain due diligence. And it's something that is really important for export. So it's something that companies must start focusing on if they aren't already. And so one negative of this is that smaller companies may struggle to deal with this type of detail and to provide certifications. It's expensive often, so they might be left behind with developments like this. But on the other hand, with supply chain, the smaller companies are often able to control their supply chains and have very good relationships with existing bases. And yeah. Then risk management. So as I already alluded to, there are quite a few risks to the EGD generally. And because of the trading from Africa to Europe, some of those things that those in the industry and economists believe, there may be increased inequality. So as I keep on mentioning, it's not the EU's idea to leave anyone behind. They certainly see the EGD as a way to change and shift policy and supply chain on a global scale. And so I think that's why it is quite progressive, and they have got very high goals. So the downside is that it might impact oil-dependent and mineral-rich African countries, and those two are separate. Obviously, oil-dependent or fossil fuel-dependent countries, the difficulty there is that they may not be so palatable for EU companies if they are using fossil fuels that won't assist in the certification or the due diligence that is undertaken, and then trading partners and existing companies who use those sources will be left behind. But from a debate sort of perspective, it's quite unfair because Africa still, even though South Africa is quite intensive, only accounts for 3% of global carbon emissions. So I'm sure many of you have heard all of the debates that Africa is being pushed to obviously become to low carbon economies, but we haven't had the benefit of an industrialization era like Europe and other countries have had the benefits of. So there's a lot of criticism from that perspective, saying that obviously Africa will be pushed towards renewable energy, and often that can lead to job losses, and also some countries just don't have the investment and the support that they need to champion renewable projects like the likes of Europe have. And another aspect that it could lead to is stranded assets. So obviously, Africa being rich in oil and gas, it may then have, it might have to shift away from using that as a source and essentially just leave those assets. Then there's also the possibility of loss in the export market. Part of the EGD also focuses on local production, and that makes sense because obviously if you can produce something locally, you cut down on transport straight away, and so that lowers your emissions to a large extent, and it shortens your supply chain. So from that perspective, there is a lot of funding that will be provided for local content and local production. And while that is great from a global perspective to cut down on the emissions, it may again impact our exports, where those products, because they're being developed locally, may also become cheaper, and so there won't be an incentive for the EU companies to then import from Africa. And then there's also the aspect which I've already touched on, the risks that certification and standards will become more stringent because of the EGD. South Africa is already under quite a lot of pressure from exporting of fruit and vegetables. There was the citrus black spot issue a while ago, which really impacted our export industry. And so it's very likely that those stringent regulations may have a negative impact. But again, if our exports, if the companies can just focus on these aspects sooner rather than later, I think there's a way to avoid losing out on these export routes. And yeah, just to sort of sum it up, wealthy nations really do have a few steps ahead because they can invest in these green developments, whereas Africa obviously doesn't have the same investment opportunities. Then opportunities, which is also important to focus on. From an agricultural perspective, I'm sure many have already heard that Africa is referred to as the food basket of the world. Food demand is set to rise by 60% by 2050. Europe already lacks the land necessary to upscale their production. And so it really is important. And this is possibly why Africa is specifically mentioned in the EGD, because there is an awareness that a partnership between Africa and Europe is essential if they have to supply food to their EU members and individuals. And so it's important that where there is funding available, I think they have actually earmarked it for Africa. So that's a small drop compared to the trillion that will be provided for the various aspects of the EGD, but there is something at least. And an interesting aspect as well is that with the new technology and especially things relating to food, there's a focus even by Europe, as much as there's criticism and debate on genetically modified crops. South Africa and quite a few African countries are already using GM crops, obviously for drought resistance. They use less fertilizers and pesticides, and that also assists with things like not necessarily organic farming, because I think you still you need to avoid GM, but that is a positive thing that our GM crops are already being used across Africa, which the EU is going to focus on more and more. And then another interesting aspect is business models. So there's a focus on changing existing business models and linking to small farmers and communities as well as NGOs. So again, there's an ability to create carbon credits with agriculture when the agriculture is obviously done in a sustainable manner. So there is a benefit definitely to focusing on that type of agriculture. Then looking at minerals, as I mentioned, obviously moving to a low carbon economy, the focus is renewable sources, and Africa has supply of a lot of the minerals that are used in renewable sources like solar panels and obviously your catalytic converters in your cars, various aspects like that. So Africa will have to be obviously used for the mineral rich resources that we have. Green hydrogen is also, that's another source that the EU is focusing on, and something that Africa, I think, will definitely be able to provide. Then just some of the types of minerals that I mentioned, they're things like nickel, cobalt, lithium, rare earth minerals, iron, copper, phosphate, platinum, group metals, and manganese and graphite. Okay, and that's sort of the end of my presentation, but generally, I think the majority of the information is that although this is a very vast program and the goals and aims that the EU have, there really is opportunity. And most importantly, Africa just has to focus on supporting and providing investment where they can. So either channeling the funds that are provided in Europe to Africa, or hopefully raising funds locally in Africa to really support the markets and the industries that need to export to Europe. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. Mansour, can we hand over to you to take us through CBAM and teach us a bit about that? Let's just come off mute, Mansour.
Certainly, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just waiting for my slideshow to open into presentation mode. Let's just give it another click. Okay. Is that in presentation mode, Jessica? Fantastic. Although the topic of my talk is on CBAM, I think it's useful to start with a very brief primer on carbon tax in South Africa, because the aim of this talk is to look at the effect of CBAM on companies which are currently paying carbon tax in South Africa. Now, our carbon tax is implemented came into law in 2019. It was implemented in a phased approach. The first phase was meant to be characterized by a fairly low level of carbon tax and a fairly high level of allowances or emissions. The effect of that approach meant that companies were in effect given the settling in period with a relatively low rate of carbon tax and fairly high offsets in the form of allowances. And that meant that the effective rate of carbon tax was quite low compared to the statutory rate of carbon tax. As we exit the first phase and moving to the second phase, that will start reversing. The carbon tax rate, a price path has been announced by National Treasury up until 2030. And so we're going to see a steeper increase in the statutory rates of carbon tax. A paper will be released this year on the design of the allowances for the purposes of calculating carbon tax. The purpose of that paper would be to look at how the allowances should be redesigned or reformulated. So to the extent there's a decrease in the allowances in future, then one will start seeing an uptick in the effective rate of carbon tax, because the tax shield which the allowances provide will start being reduced over time. So that's a very important development for South African carbon taxpayers. not only the rate of increase in the statutory rate, but also the rate of decrease in the allowances, which is shielding much of the emissions from actual carbon tax. And the reason for this approach being followed was to give SA companies time to adapt to the impact of a carbon tax. Our carbon tax is levied on pretty much an upstream basis. If we imagine a pyramid, it's levied on companies at the top of the pyramid. It's levied on generators and producers and manufacturers. So generators of electricity, producers of cement and steel, and manufacturers tend to pay the carbon tax. And the idea was that the price which they pay will then be included in their goods which they provide and will then filter through the rest of the economy. So the way it's been designed makes sense from a revenue perspective. There's fewer taxpayers. The further up you move, the further you move up the pyramid, makes it easier to administer from a revenue point of view. But those costs, the idea is that those costs will filter through the economy. So that's just very briefly the SA carbon tax. Now we have the introduction in a phased manner as well of the carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU. Now the CBAM fits within a range of carbon pricing mechanisms. And sometimes we do get asked which other countries have implemented carbon tax in the way South Africa has. And we usually say that the question needs to be broadened because carbon tax is one form of carbon pricing. Emission trading system is another form of carbon pricing. So the fact that we price carbon by levying a carbon tax and another country prices carbon or places a price on carbon by imposing an emissions trading system doesn't mean that we are sort of walking it alone in the route of carbon tax. We've simply decided that carbon tax works better in the SA economy than an emissions trading system. But when looking at carbon pricing, there's different forms of carbon pricing which different countries follow. Not all of them might implement a carbon tax. They might go the ETS route. Some countries might have carbon tax for certain sectors and ETS for other sectors and implement them in a harmonized, combined manner. So the issue that we really should be looking at is which countries price carbon and what is the mechanism that they use to price carbon. So looking at the CBAM, it will be a carbon tariff which will be imposed on the importation of carbon-intensive products into the EU. So the purpose of the CBAM, and you had a reference to this in your earlier slides, Colin, to prevent carbon leakage. The EU, which prices carbon resulting from operations within the EU, what they don't want is operations outside of the EU. Say steel is produced at a plant outside the EU, and that steel is exported into the EU. That the price of that steel doesn't attract a price on carbon, whereas steel produced within the EU does, because that creates the mismatch in the pricing, and it gives an incentive to companies to shift manufacturing operations to outside the EU and export their products into the EU. What the CBAM does is it tries to obtain that equivalence between products produced within the EU and those which are imported into the EU. So the CBAM is proposed to be a regulation so that it will be applicable and enforceable by law in all EU member states. While the EU ETS covers EU countries, the CBAM will apply to goods produced outside the EU, and importers of those goods into the EU will pay a carbon adjustment which corresponds to the price that would have been paid if the goods had been produced under the EU's carbon pricing rules. And when we look at the graph, at the diagram at the bottom of this slide, we'll see the non-EU supplier. And there's a shipment of goods which goes into the EU. That supplier, which would register as it exports from its country of origin, and then it's importing into the EU, gets a CBAM certificate, and there's an EU buyer within the EU. The CBAM will be applicable to that leg on the left-hand side of the diagram. On the right-hand side of the diagram, one has the EU buyer, the importer, and the EU supplier, for which the CBAM will not be applicable because they're both within the EU. Now, the pricing of the CBAM certificates will be defined by the weekly average auction cost of emission allowances under the ETS. And currently, the pricing of those emission allowances under the ETS exceeds 85 euros per ton, and is projected to rise to almost 100 euros, which we inserted the rand equivalent. Now, when you look at the rand equivalent of that euro pricing, it's still fairly significantly higher than the proposed price path for the carbon tax in South Africa. National Treasury has released a pricing path for carbon tax rates in South Africa. As we would have seen from 2019 in this graph up until about 2024, 2023, the price path is quite gradual. Then from 2023 onwards, it starts increasing in a much more steeper manner. This price path has been announced up until 2030 for now, and further price increases will be dealt with in the annual budget review process by National Treasury. But when you look at the rand equivalent amounts in South Africa, where we're looking at a carbon tax a price perhaps running between 450 and 500 rand per ton of CO2 equivalent emissions, and look at what's likely to be in the EU ETS scheme, there is still a difference that will emerge between those two pricing mechanisms. And it's that difference that South African exporters of products should be aware of when these products are exported into the EU. Now, at present, the CBAM regulations, which are quite comprehensive, they require a bit of time to work through and to understand the impacts. They've identified sectors which will be covered and emissions which will be covered. So the sectors to be covered by the scheme includes the highly intensive, high energy intensive user sectors such as electricity and iron and steel, and the emissions which are covered by the CBAM. It also potentially includes direct and indirect emissions. Now that's different to the way our carbon tax has been structured, because South African entities liable to our carbon tax will pay carbon tax on the direct emissions. So a South African entity which says a mine, it will pay carbon tax on its direct emissions, but the electricity which it purchases from Eskom, it does not pay carbon tax on that electricity. The electricity generation is paid by Eskom. At the moment, Eskom doesn't pay any carbon tax because of a mechanism within the carbon tax regime referred to as there's a neutrality mechanism whereby Eskom enjoys additional deductions, but it's still subject to the carbon tax, just does not have any carbon tax liability at the moment. So our law also recognizes the distinction between direct emissions and indirect emissions. We impose tax on the generator on its direct emissions, but the indirect emissions, whoever supplies the goods, that supplier will pay carbon tax. For that supplier, it's a direct emission, but for the customer, it's an indirect emission. So we make that distinction to prevent a double taxation of the emission. Whereas for CBAM, it seems that for certain types of emissions, they're looking at direct and indirect emissions. So the base of the emissions covered by the CBAM, one have to pay very careful attention to see what it covers. The greenhouse gases covered includes the familiar greenhouse gases that's also covered under our carbon tax. But I think the base of the emissions will be something very important, as well as the sectors that will be covered by the CBAM. The implementation of the CBAM. So you'll see from this image that we took October spelled with a K, so it looks like it's a German spelling that's coming there. There's a transitional period, so it is being implemented in a phased manner. Payment obligation will start in 2026, and full implementation will occur from 2030 onwards, which sort of mimics the way our carbon tax came in as well. That was a phased approach and it builds up over time. So unlike other taxes such as corporate income tax, where the move is towards lower tax rates, and we've seen our rate of corporate income tax drop from 28 to 27%, in the field of carbon tax, we're seeing the opposite thing happen. We're seeing a push for higher rates occurring in this respect. And for those entities who are liable to pay these amounts, from a corporate income tax point of view, the question always emerges, whatever we pay under carbon tax or related taxes, does it qualify as deductions for income tax purposes, so that you're not paying tax on your carbon tax payments, but you get the relief from your corporate income tax liabilities for carbon tax payments. So from 2026, importers will need to buy CBAM certificates based on the emissions content of the imported goods. It will be fully implemented in 2030 to 2032 when the distribution of the free allowances in the EU ETS will end. Not an expert in the EU ETS scheme itself, but I think for SA entities, it would be important to be aware of the impact of the CBAM on the export of their products into the EU. CBAM obligations. To comply with CBAM, importers will have to take various steps. I think these slides will be shared with the persons who attend the presentation, so I won't necessarily go through every item on there, but we thought we'd list some of the more important points to be borne in mind for those entities which are importing products into the EU. The impact of CBAM on exporters liable to carbon tax. So if a non-EU producer, such as an SA entity, can show they've already paid a carbon price for the production of imported goods in a third country, that amount can be deducted for the EU importer. Now, I think that part is going to become the critical part for SA entities, how that calculation is to be performed. And the good news is that we still have a few years before 2026 when the payment obligation starts to work out exactly what that means, what the paperwork requirements are, or what the calculation methodology is that will be applied in order to ensure that the export of carbon-intensive goods from SA to the EU doesn't get slapped with a very high CBAM charge and makes the goods uncompetitive. So there will be within the regulations notes setting up the supporting evidence which will be required or which needs to be provided, and the different types of mechanisms either on a case-by-case basis, or the EU and third countries could enter into agreements that could streamline the process for applying this reduction. But I think this would probably be the essence of the key point that SA companies need to understand what these documentation requirements are, so that these can then be shared with the importers in the EU to say that a carbon tax has already been paid on those products in South Africa. And how does that carbon tax then get taken into account when calculating the CBAM certificates, which needs to be purchased by the EU importer of those products? And that, Jessica and Carlin, that sums up my brief overview of the CBAM scheme and its the way it interacts with the carbon tax in South Africa. So I think it's something that needs to be looked into very, very seriously, and it's the sort of thing one needs to do a whiteboard exercise, go through a few examples, look at how it will play itself out, so that SA entities are relatively assured of what the repercussions of the scheme will be. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mansoor. And thanks as well for touching on the carbon tax regime in South Africa as well as a starting point and as a way of understanding that first before trying to look at the impacts of CBAM. And I think perhaps one observation that's quite interesting is that if we look at CBAM being fully implemented by 2030, and we know that 2030 is also the year that we are all chasing in terms of the race to net zero and the Paris Agreement commitments that have been made nationally by countries. We really do, as was put out in the most recent IPCC report, the next 7 years are really the most critical. So critical for both businesses to get ready for the regulatory change that you and Colin have sketched coming from the EU, particularly that impacts them, as well as the regulatory change that we'll see domestically following that and in reaction to that European development, but also get ready in the sense of actually really focusing on decarbonizing operations, so that from a South African perspective and thinking just of our country now, we are able to to reach our NDC commitments by 2030. So thank you very much for that and for highlighting that timeline, because when we all started talking about ESG, climate change, and these other environmental objectives, it felt very much like the timeline was far in the future, and that even though we knew that climate change particularly was a very real risk to us and to our businesses and to our communities, it felt as if change could happen at an incremental pace because there was quite a lot of time to right the ship, so to speak. But I think the take-home point from the EU Green Deal message, as well as the timelines put forward for implementation of these changes, is that actually time really is running out, and the time to take action is now. So thank you very much to both of you. Is there anything that either of you would like to say in closing before I sum up? No, okay, we've covered everything then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I saw there was a question in the Q&A on the compliance of CBAM with WTO rules. If Nathan doesn't mind, if we could respond to that question separately, or perhaps just to the group as well, because I think it's relevant for everyone's purposes. But it's slightly out of the tax domain, but I can certainly have a look at that and we can provide an answer to that.
I think similarly, there was also a question on just generally the impact of investment in Africa and the EGD. I'll give a more sort of full answer, similar to Mansour. But I think generally there will be an impact. I think there is already an impact, Jess, you can maybe even speak to it, of investments in Africa moving away from carbon intensive industries and projects. So I think the EGD will definitely further impact those investments.
Yes, thanks, Colin. Thanks for raising that, and agreed. That's a point that we can come back to separately, but already we have seen the additional conditions being imposed on borrowers, African borrowers, seeking to raise funds from offshore, and whether those be private funds through private equity, or whether those be DFI funds or bank funds, we have seen there to be increased requirements around so-called ESG factors, increased requirements for representations and warranties and undertakings being given by borrower businesses in order to attract that funding, as well as increased obligations on an ongoing reporting basis to report against sustainability objectives, and to actually collect that data and feed that data back to lenders or funders who provided that funding. And that's not only in the context of so-called sustainable finance, where the actual funding itself has a sustainability linked component to it, or it has been given for a green or a social purpose, but actually in general funding as well. And I think that development is also foreshadowed or complemented by, and it links back to the point that Colin was making around supply chains. We have also seen an increase in ESG metric-based due diligence questionnaires being imposed on suppliers when a contract is being signed, or goods or services contract is being put in place. So more due diligence being done on supply chain in order for those contracts to be won. And similarly, to go back to the question that was originally asked, more obligation around these factors and these metrics being imposed on borrowers seeking to raise funds. Absolutely. And that's not limited to the EU Green Deal. It's actually sometimes based on either internal requirements of the particular financial institution or the particular region from where the money comes. So those are not consistent, and there has not been convergence in that regard, but there is definitely an uptick.
And thanks very much for that, Jess. Perhaps what I could do is I could share my preliminary thoughts on the question posed about CBAM and WTO. Because it seems that the philosophy behind CBAM is to ensure that goods produced in the EU are treated the same as goods produced outside the EU, which are then exported into the EU. So it doesn't seem to have a discriminatory intent. The idea is to have an equality between the jurisdictions or the geographical areas where the goods are produced. So I think from a compliance point of view, it probably would pass muster, because that would be the argument that would be put forward, that if there's a producer of steel within the EU who's subject to the EU ETS and has to comply with that system, which increases the cost of producing steel within the EU, that the purpose of the CBAM then appears to be that the producer of the steel outside the CU, which then exports the steel into the EU, shouldn't get a preferential treatment to the one producer that's inside the EU, and that if this mechanism results in a parity of treatment, then I think it probably would satisfy any WTO rules and regulations. But obviously, it's something we need to look into a bit deeper. That was me just giving some preliminary thoughts on that point, though.
Thanks, Mansoor. Thanks for those preliminary thoughts. And thank you to both you and Colin for joining us today in this presentation and for sharing your thoughts on the EU Green Deal and CBAM and what that could mean for African companies in trade relations with Europe. Thank you very much for that. And as we said at the beginning, I think this is very much the start of this conversation. And again, I invite any of our participants who wish to discuss this further or engage further on I guess, more further points flowing from this discussion, please to reach out to Colin or Mansoor directly and take up that discussion with them, or join us for a drink and meet them in person and carry on that discussion. So finally, just in closing, to remind of a bit of an advert, so to speak, for our next 3 webinars that will be coming up next week. Next week we will, and I think Colin touched on this briefly in a presentation, we will have Stephanie Bush of our Namibian office talking about green hydrogen in the Namibian context and sharing her experiences in working in that space and what's been learned from the Namibian green hydrogen project and example, which is of course very relevant to us in South Africa and of interest to us. We will also have a session on biodiversity, unpacking what biodiversity risk is, what it means, particularly in light of the recent COP, and also looking at, and Mansoor will be joining us on that panel as well, looking at some tax incentives linked to biodiversity and also unpacking the future of biodiversity credits and where that nascent market could be going from a South African perspective. And then finally, our last session to round up the CPD series will be on BEE and the developments in that regard, and the developments in the transformation requirements, particularly for the financial services sector. And we'll have Sanjay Kassan of our BEE team in the corporate commercial department talking to that with one of his colleagues. So 3 quite different sessions coming up next week, but also very relevant, we believe, to the industry and to be considered. Please do join us for those. So thank you very much again. And I must say, I meant to say in the beginning, and I completely forgot, Mansoor and I are actually sitting in our Stellenbosch office today because we are both attending SAVCA. And so we're very happy that we managed to present without a break in technology, because we sort of on the foot, so we weren't quite sure how that was going to go. So we're very happy that we managed to get through the presentation without any mishaps. And if there were some glitches as we went and the sound quality wasn't perhaps as good as usual, then we do apologize. As I said, it's because we are in Stellenbosch currently. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye.